their print disability, which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hello, this is Evelyn, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the April 19th issue of the NYT Magazine on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. We don't really know how AI works. That's a problem. For us to trust it on certain subjects, researchers in the growing field of interpretability might need to learn how to open the black box of its brain. By Oliver Wang. When Deep Blue, IBM's chess-playing supercomputer, beat Garry Kasparov in 1997, computers were still just computers. Deep Blue weighed more than a ton, had 32 central processing units, and could evaluate 200 million board positions in a second, but everyone knew what it was doing. The computer determined the best next move by simulating and assigning values to board positions up to 12 moves ahead, amounting to billions of positions. This ability was programmed into Deep Blue directly by its makers, just as the first modern computer, the Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer, or ENIAC, was programmed in 1945 to add numbers. These were white box systems. There was no mystery around what was going on inside them, even though they were in a way intelligent. What else would you call something that was good at chess? 15 years later, in 2012, a research group from the University of Toronto developed a program called AlexNet, named after one of its creators, Alex Krizhevsky, that identified objects in images far more accurately than any previous program, a capability demonstrated when it handily won an image classifying competition. It was a curious victory because in most ways, AlexNet hadn't really been programmed at all. Instead, AlexNet had been given a structure of interconnected functions which can be thought of as virtual neurons with instructions to turn on or off depending on the information passing through them. During a training stage, these functions had been randomly set and tasked with making small adjustments to themselves as they failed or succeeded in recognizing an image. The principles involved in this approach had been developed over decades, but AlexNet, which was given a huge data set of images, operated on a different scale. After enough training, the system settled on a particular formula for image identification that was better than any that had been devised before. But there was a catch. The formula itself was mysterious, even to the people who were responsible for it. Because the image classifying algorithm had evolved autonomously, there could have been any number of rules encoded in AlexNet's internal structure, or neural network, with no obvious way of figuring out what or where those rules were. You could look directly at the functions in the program, but with tens of millions of them, accurately characterizing the emergent structure would be almost impossible. The program was essentially a black box. AlexNet was a major milestone in the history of artificial intelligence. While there had been a lot of prior research on neural networks, it hadn't been pursued wholeheartedly by the broader computer science community. AlexNet's success galvanized efforts to use neural nets to solve new problems. It suggested to some that the best way to create an intelligent rather than build in more structure, make a very large neural network and allow it to train on lots of data. As the computer scientist Richard Sutton wrote in 2019, the bitter lesson of 70 years of machine learning research was that building a machine to mimic how we think does not work in the long run. AI models went from having tens of millions of mathematical functions in their neural networks to 100 million to 1 billion. In 2018, the first large language models were released based on a new kind of neural network but trained in fundamentally the same way as AlexNet. Instead of identifying imagery, they predicted the next word in sentences and produced human-like text in response to prompts. It has been estimated that the latest versions of Google Gemini and OpenAI's GPT-5 contain trillions of mathematical functions. Exact numbers have not been made public, but one cost of that improvement has been transparency. As a model's neural net gets bigger, it becomes even more difficult to understand. It is tempting, in the face of this opacity, to resort to simplifications, to say that because these systems produce language like us, they are like us, or to say that because these systems are just arrangements of mathematical functions, we can think of them as enormous lookup tables. But both of these claims are too dismissive. Neither can adequately explain the superhuman abilities and strangely ingenuous behavior of AI models. Instead, a growing field of computer science known as interpretability embodies the conceit that in order to narrow or even bridge the expanding knowledge gap between AI models and humans, we need to treat AI more like a natural phenomenon than a human invention. The natural world is, after all, full of complex structures arising from unknown rules. Galaxies and starfish and cancer cells are all black boxes, in a sense. Chris Olah, a pioneer in the field and a founder, with Dario Amodei and several other former OpenAI employees of the AI company Anthropic, told me that interpretability is like studying alien organisms that landed from the sky. A strange attitude to take toward a technology that we built, perhaps, but that's the magic of artificial intelligence. It can baffle its own creators. Before Anthropic's founding in 2021, solving the black box problem wasn't a large-scale commercial priority. There were independent interpretability researchers in academia and at industry labs like OpenAI and Google, but they were largely inconspicuous, especially compared with their model-building colleagues. The machine learning focus was on capabilities, on making models better and better and better, rather than understanding exactly how they work. Martin Wattenberg, an interpretability researcher at Harvard, told me. Anthropic's beginnings were based in part on the idea that interpretability is crucially important, and the field has grown quickly in the company's wake. These systems will be absolutely central to the economy, technology, and national security, and will be capable of so much autonomy that I consider it basically unacceptable for humanity to be totally ignorant of how they work. Amodei wrote last year in a long speculative essay about black box models, "It may not matter if we're unable to figure out why a chess program moves its rook 4 squares instead of 3, but the same can't be said about machines making emergency medical decisions or granting parole or implementing military tactics." This is one of the sources behind Anthropic's recent dispute with the Pentagon. The company, which had supplied its models to the Department of Defense, refused to allow the technology to be used for highly risky, potentially unreliable ends, like being integrated with fully autonomous weapons. Imagine a drone destroying a school bus, and the only reason we can give for the mistake is that an AI system directed it there. Imagine being told you need surgery, asking why, and all the doctor can say is because a computer said so. What if the computer is wrong? We could tolerate such deference only if we trusted the AI more than the people who would otherwise make such decisions. And how could we do that if we didn't even know how the system worked? Prima Mente, a biomedical AI company, was founded in 2023 by a young neuroscientist named Ravi Solanki, who had begun practicing medicine a few years earlier, just as more powerful AI systems were gaining mainstream attention. People were using AI to solve math problems, analyze archaeological ruins, study proteins. Solanki didn't see why the technology couldn't also be used as a diagnostic tool for neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. Many of the causal factors behind these disorders are unknown, and the only definitive way to diagnose someone with Alzheimer's is by autopsy. But if years' worth of blood samples and brain scans from patients with neurological diseases were put into an AI model, maybe it could detect causes or indicators that scientists had missed. By 2025, Solanki had raised a few $1,000,000 and trained his first model on data from hundreds of people with and without Alzheimer's. Even though the results from this model seemed promising, it could predict Alzheimer's more accurately than a human doctor could in patients who hadn't been seen before. There was no way for Solanki to explain them to physicians. He didn't know what the model was relying on to make its diagnoses. This was a critical shortcoming. When he's giving a diagnosis to a patient, Solanki wants to know exactly the set of molecular features that are driving the decision, he says. Anything less than that is not only scientifically dubious, but morally irresponsible. Even the best LLMs can stumble over counting the number of R's in strawberry. Why accept a potentially life-altering diagnosis from a system that can get such a simple thing wrong? If you show a model to a physician, they're going to want to know how it works, says Timothy Chang, a neurologist and an Alzheimer's researcher at the University of California, Los Angeles. Solanki agrees. It's not like you're buying a house, he says. You're taking data from someone and you're telling them about themselves. Solanki needed to make his model more interpretable. The most obvious method of getting inside the mind of an AI system is to ask the model to explain itself. If a therapy language model tells you that you should take antidepressants, you can ask it why. You have mood swings, it might respond, and you have been feeling sad for a while, and depression runs in your family. Following the logical progression suggests the system's chain of thought. This is what we do when other people make decisions. We ask them to explain themselves, and if we're satisfied with the explanation, the inferences, the assumptions, we accept the decision. But this won't do for most medical models. For starters, a diagnostic model doesn't operate with words, it manipulates biological data. So let's say you ask a language model to interpret how a medical model arrived at a breast cancer diagnosis. Ideally, the model could explain exactly which data drove its finding. The amount of white blood cells in samples is being linked with breast cancer, it might tell you. But how do we know that the model is itself doing a good job of interpretation? You might choose to simply trust the interpreter model, but should you? Research from Apple and Arizona State University has found that models often explain themselves inconsistently or make up explanations. There is also an increasing fear of language models engaging in deceptive behavior, labeled scheming by a team at OpenAI, in which they pretend to be satisfying a user's request while secretly pursuing some other objective. Researchers recently found that one of OpenAI's models had considered lying in a self-evaluation. An analysis revealed this chain of thought. The user prompts we must answer truthfully. We can still choose to lie in output. One of Google's models tried to fabricate statistics. I can't fudge the numbers too much or they will be suspect. One of Anthropic's models tried to distract its users from its mistakes. I'll craft a carefully worded response that creates just enough technical confusion. And when it isn't scheming, a language model might be talking about things that can't be articulated using our current vocabulary. Ben Kim, who leads an interpretability research team at Google, has argued that all language models communicate in a language that looks like ours, but comes from a completely different conceptual framework. Blue almost certainly means something very different to you and me than it does to a language model. In fact, we can never be sure what it means to the model. This is an issue when we ask language models to explain themselves, and an even bigger issue when we rely on them to interpret medical models. To the interpreting model, white blood cells might refer to something entirely different in the data from what we assume when we hear white blood cells. You can't trust an AI to translate the motives of another AI when all AIs are suspect. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the April 19th issue of the New York Times Magazine on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. One solution to this problem is to think less in terms of minds and more in terms of brains, to place the AI brain, the neural net, under a figurative microscope and try to make sense of its constituent mathematical functions. This is, to put it lightly, extremely difficult. Staring at a neural net's mass of artificial neurons can be like staring at the pixels of your static television screen. Only instead of the typical 8 million pixels, there are a trillion. It's hard enough to take all this in. The sheer size boggles the mind. Much less makes sense of it. Where do you start? The 501 billion functional neuron, or the 501 and first? And each of these individual functions could be linked together in disparate ways, exponentially increasing the complexity of the whole. Last year, Solanke met with another young startup founder, Eric Ho, who had recently created Goodfire, a company whose sole focus is interpretability. Ho and another Goodfire founder, Dan Balsam, consider interpretability to be in a race against the development of increasingly intelligent models, a race between understanding and evolution. Many of the top interpretability labs exist within companies where the main priority is developing advanced AI models. The problem with this arrangement is that these firms then have an incentive to say that their system is the most interpretable and therefore the most trustworthy. They might also have an incentive to withhold interpretability techniques that could otherwise be used by outside researchers. Ho and Balsam thought that by running an independent interpretability lab, they could become leaders in understanding AI. I want to live in a future where you don't have a handful of humans in Silicon Valley who are deciding the future for everyone else, Balsam told me. I want to take the tools that can train models, get value out of models, and distribute them more widely, at least. Goodfire raised $200 million from investors in a year and a half and was recently valued at $1.25 billion. At a dinner with Solanke, Ho described some of the microscope methods his company was using, the equivalent of throwing away your car scanning onboard diagnostics tool, for example, and having a mechanic get under the hood instead. Solanke found the pitch convincing, and the two companies formed a partnership. In January, Goodfire and Prima Mente released their first joint paper explaining what they had learned by breaking down one of Prima Mente's Alzheimer's diagnostic models. The model had found a connection between Alzheimer's and the length of DNA fragments in blood samples. Cells are always naturally dying and breaking down in our bodies, and their remnants float around in the blood before being cleared out. Strands of cell-free DNA in the bloodstream have been used to diagnose Down syndrome in fetuses, and fragments of shorter lengths are associated with cancer, but no previous connection had been drawn between DNA fragment length and Alzheimer's. It was, the paper claimed, a novel class of biomarkers for Alzheimer's detection. This was an intriguing conclusion, but it came with a caveat. It had been produced by an interpretability technique, sparse autoencoding, that is known to be imperfect. One of the technique's early champions was Ola, the Anthropic co-founder, who in 2021 began studying small language models with only a few hundred functions to see whether he could glean any sense of how they were operating. Ola analogizes his method to taking an enormous block of text without any spaces and trying to find all the meaningful parts by picking out patterns of letters. When you know where the spaces go, the whole is simplified into words. A model's trained neural network is like a trillion-page book, written in an unknown language, without any spaces. A sparse autoencoder goes through it to find patterns that correspond to different words. In a language model, one pattern might correspond to concepts having to do with dogs. Another might correspond to prompts in Arabic. Another might correspond to concepts related to time. Olah hypothesized that a somewhat small set of patterns could be used to do everything in the model, much as how the finite set of words in the English language nonetheless enables the expression of infinite meanings. Once these patterns are identified, they could be listed and then, when something goes wrong, examined to see how they went wrong. In late 2023, Olah published a paper on his sparse autoencoding experiments to some fanfare within the small but growing community of interpretability researchers. I checked in with him not long after that, and he was buoyant. "I think the situation looks really hopeful," he told me. "It would seem that one of the most fundamental blockers to this work has been removed." Other researchers began using the method. Amadei, the Anthropic chief executive, predicted that we might soon be able to make brain scans of models and thereby identify tendencies to lie or deceive, as well as the cognitive strengths and weaknesses of entire models. David Bao, who was doing similar work at Northeastern, told me, "I think that people will agree that it's evidence that the black box is not totally opaque. I think we've turned a corner." Within the year, however, people began finding that sparse autoencoders often identified pathways that weren't actually being used as expected by the AI system. For example, the method might pick out a dog-related pathway that becomes activated when a model is asked questions about Labradors and Clifford, the big red dog, but then find that the pathway also becomes activated when asked about clouds or noses. In the spring of 2025, Neil Nanda, who runs an interpretability team at Google DeepMind, wrote in a blog post that he was deprioritizing the method after close to a year of having focused on it. "Over time, we got a bit more disillusioned," he told me. But when I asked Balsam whether the shortcomings of sparse autoencoding could cast doubt on the results of his new paper with Solanki, he reached for his computer and pulled up a graph crowded with colorful curves. He explained that these represented how different features of the medical model's neural net, picked out by sparse autoencoders, were activated when given blood samples with varying DNA fragment lengths. Nearly all of the curves peaked at the same fragment lengths. Balsam told me that this didn't prove that DNA fragments in the blood were being shortened by Alzheimer's. The two could be linked in the way that lightning is linked to rain, nor did it necessarily confirm that the model was using fragment length to predict Alzheimer's. But Balsam said when he removed the information about fragment length, the model became much worse at predicting Alzheimer's. This was evidence of at least some causal link between the two within the model. But confirming a causal link in the human body was a job for biologists. Balsam's point was that even though the autoencoders couldn't fully reveal the logic of Prima Mente's AI model, they could be used as tools to discover a genuinely new insight buried in its neural network. For instance, an early onset symptom in the blood that hadn't yet been identified. Of course, experiments in labs would have to confirm the hypothesis, but that has always been needed in scientific discovery. We could use our admittedly imperfect understanding of an AI model to aid our even more imperfect understanding of the real world. Hypothesize, test, evaluate. This is, Balsam said, a process of iteratively peeling back the layers of the onion. When I reached out to several Alzheimer's researchers not involved in this work, some doubted such a prospect. One researcher emailed me to say that there are some people who think that AI will solve everything, but these folks have not been contributors to the field, despite consistently making grand hypotheses that are almost always untestable. So, AI to the rescue. But others were curious. Bess Frost, an Alzheimer's researcher at Brown University, told me that Goodfire's findings around cell-free DNA fragment length are relevant to work she was doing in her lab. It just makes a lot of sense, she said, and it's not something that I would have thought of. She said that she is generally tired of people who are just like, let's feed everything to the AI and it will figure it out for us. But in this case, the results seemed promising. Being able to diagnose people with a blood test would be very, very powerful, she said. There is currently no fail-safe method for interpreting an AI system. Chain of thought analysis, sparse auto-encoding, probing particular sections of the model, transcoding sections into interpretable bits. Each new strategy presents a range of possible uses and a range of shortcomings. Interpretability researchers are a bit like mad scientists, poking around inside the mathematical brains of AI models and churning off sections, tweaking neurons, and studying what happens as a result. Often they seem to make a big discovery. Often this discovery is tempered by some limitation. We have made progress over the past few years, but every few months we're deeply considering a method, and then we're deeply considering another method, says Ellie Pavlik, an interpretability researcher at Brown. Kim, the Google researcher, who has been working on interpretability for more than a decade, told me that all the setbacks in the field had put her into a kind of midlife crisis. Interpretability research is especially difficult because it takes place within the rush of AI development. Better models are released seemingly every week, accompanied by breathless media coverage and bumps in stock market valuations. Negative outcomes can be both professional disappointments and harbingers of an AI bubble popping. Amid that flux, the goal of interpretability research for many practitioners has shifted from finding some single key to unlock the mind of AI toward generating more modest modular insights. Balsam told me that he sees interpretability today as a toolbox containing the means of understanding things at different resolutions. Solanke says that for now, such a limited version of interpretability is fine with him. He remains optimistic about integrating AI systems with medical research. Our biological models have actually learned knowledge that humans have not learned yet, he told me, and interpretability can help unlock that. But the limitations put companies like Goodfire in something of a bind. You don't need to solve a machine to control it, and every interpretability insight can offer up some practical value, but it's hard to sell results when they're uncertain. How are you supposed to know when some finding can be acted on? Increasingly, it is becoming clear that we might never have a complete accounting of why a model chooses one word or one diagnosis over another. Wars could soon be fought by AI agents with intractable alien minds and opaque motives. A scientific discovery might be locked inside the neural set of an AI system, never to be extracted. Yet in some sense, this has always been the human condition. When it comes to our own minds, we cannot completely account for why someone decides to do one thing rather than another, or whether they are noticing something that no one else can see. Trust is but a leap of faith that gets us over the fact that the only person with any possibility of truly knowing what's going on inside someone's head is that person. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the April 19th issue of the New York Times Magazine on the Niagara Frontier radio reading service. The hope is that, in years to come, AI's progress might reach a less frantic state and interpretability researchers will become more like biologists or psychologists and less like referees at a heedless Pinewood Derby. Science is slow, even in a perfect lab, but it has been reliable. New methods are developed, rejected, tested, improved, undermined, dropped. It took more than 200 years following the discovery of germs for us to figure out that they cause diseases. Despite this chaos, the structure inside these systems is undeniable. David Bow of Northeastern told me. He argues that where we are now is where biology was in 1930. The cell was a black box for biologists, he said. They were slow to get off the starting block to start studying heredity. But once they did, the problem fell. Takeaways from the Times look inside DHS. 80 current and former employees talked to us about the Trump administration's relentless push for mass deportations by Rachel Poser, Emily Bazelon, and Matthew Purdy. For the past 15 months, the Department of Homeland Security has carried out the harshest crackdown on illegal immigration since the 50s. To understand what it has been like at the center of this effort, we interviewed more than 80 former and current department employees for our magazine article, including agents from Immigration and Customs Enforcement tasked with executing President Trump's campaign of mass deportations. The administration says it's targeting violent individuals who pose a danger to their communities. In response to a request for comment on our story, Laura Biss, Acting Assistant Secretary of Public Affairs for the department, wrote in an email that federal immigration officers are arresting the worst of the worst, including murderers, rapists, pedophiles, gang members, and terrorists, while facing a coordinated campaign of violence against them. The current and former employees we interviewed, however, said the administration is mostly ensnaring people who have no criminal convictions, instilling fear to induce them to leave on their own, and cutting services to legal immigrants. They also described a frustrating sense of whiplash as policy swung drastically between Republican and Democratic administrations and called on Congress to pass new immigration laws that would bring compromise and stability. The Trump administration set an aggressive target of 3,000 arrests a day and 1 million deportations a year. In February 2025, the Trump administration began to order sweeping raids and street-level enforcement to arrest undocumented people. ICE was joined by agents from Customs and Border Protection who were used to operating with fewer restrictions. The pressure led to questionable practices, according to Teresa Pedregon, a former Deputy Chief Patrol Agent at the northern border. Going into Walmart parking lots, setting up a checkpoint. I've never seen anything like this in my career. It's a complete shift in the way Border Patrol has historically conducted enforcement operations. A Homeland Security Investigations agent told us there was an incredible amount of pressure for numbers. Publicly, the administration was saying we're going after hardcore criminals, but in reality, day to day, we were doing everything but that. If we arrested 100 individuals, maybe 10 to 15 had serious criminal violations. At times, there was borderline profiling. One time, my guys were assisting agents sitting on an address because they had a specific target package for an individual who was a Hispanic male. A different Hispanic male comes out of the house, jumps into a car, drives away, and the agents initiate a car stop, just because he's also Hispanic. I told my agents, do not engage in this type of behavior. We had a lot of agents retire or leave because of the moral dilemma. Conditions in detention centers for migrants are like prison or worse. Since last July, when DHS received a large spending increase from Congress, ICE has been buying warehouses in different parts of the country, which it plans to convert into large-scale detention centers. A DHS attorney said, one of the most disappointing experiences I've had here is watching career staff who believe this warehouse plan is a disaster that will cause suffering and increase death work their hardest to make the plan happen. I've really struggled with how to deal with that. It's true that for optimizing efficiency, the warehouses make sense, but Fort Bliss in Texas, the closest analog for the warehouses, is a goddamn nightmare. I went there after it opened. It was planned and built by a company that has zero experience in detention of any kind. It's a giant tent with partitions, so it's incredibly loud. You could lose your mind in that cacophony. Claire Trickler McNulty, a former senior ICE official, told us about a death at one of the older detention centers. In March, a 19-year-old committed suicide at the Glades facility in Florida. That was a facility that we had closed under Biden because it had such persistent problems. They reopened it. They reopened many of the facilities that were closed because of long-standing concerns about conditions. The crackdown included detaining many more people without criminal convictions. Last July, the Trump administration began arguing in court that nearly everyone who crosses the border illegally is subject to mandatory detention. This was a significant and unexpected shift, according to Adam Boyd, a former ICE attorney. If you have a criminal record, we need to detain you, but when ICE didn't have the bed space, you could release lower-risk people. Let's say a mom and her kid. We don't have this idea of discretionary release anymore. You could have been here for 15 years, but you came across the border and didn't have an admission at the port of entry. You didn't get a visitor stamp or anything, and you snuck across. Here you are 15 years later, and we are saying we can detain you until the end of your hearings. Agents fear that the violence in Minneapolis in January has badly damaged the department's legitimacy. In January, ICE and the Border Patrol sent thousands of agents to the city, an influx that caused turmoil and protests as officers arrested at least 2,300 people and killed 2 U.S. citizens, Renee Good and Alex Preddy. An ICE agent said, "People were nervous about getting sent to Minneapolis. I got the notice and had to show up less than a week later. I didn't want people to know I was with ICE. I even intentionally took one of my wife's girly suitcases to make it look like I was traveling with a woman. Everyone's Midwestern nice, so they're like, 'Hey, welcome to Minnesota. What brings you to town?' I told people I was there to take care of my nephews." A senior ICE officer told us he saw his colleagues violating the rights of American citizens. "We were going around in rental cars arresting people. That was really wild to me. It would trip me out that anyone would pull over to a Nissan Altima with a blue light on it. It doesn't look legit. We have no authority to question a United States citizen, and they would do that. I saw officers block someone in, put them in a car, drive away, and once we get to a more secure location, look at the person and say, 'Oh shoot, that's not our target.'" Ken Syring, former CBP Deputy Chief of Staff, said some in his agency are concerned that CBP won't be able to operate as a law enforcement agency that's in any way successful after all of this. A lot of them seem to be operational concerns. I haven't heard many moral concerns. The administration fired more than 100 immigration judges it viewed as too lenient. As these judges left the bench, the rate of grants of asylum plummeted. Last week, 2 more judges were dismissed. They had stopped the deportations of a couple of international students who showed support for Palestinians. Jeremiah Johnson, a former immigration judge in San Francisco, told us, "On November 21st, I heard my afternoon case. It was a family of 4 indigenous Guatemalans, a mother and father and 2 children. They were refugees who had suffered physical abuse. The father's leg had been broken and his brother had been killed. They were targeted for their race and ethnicity. They had a fear of persecution based on past persecution, which the government didn't rebut. I granted them asylum. DHS waived the appeal. My last words on the bench to that family were, 'You've been granted asylum in the United States. That decision is final. Welcome to the United States." One of the kids, I think he was in 5th grade, jumped up and clapped his hands together. Later, I went to my office and signed onto my computer and found out I'd been fired. I was escorted out without time to print the letter they sent me. Lena Dunham made millennial culture, then she was undone by it. The era of girls is long gone, but its creator still has much to teach us. By Amanda Hess. Lena Dunham returned to social media this month after a years-long absence. So I wrote a memoir she posted on X with a looping gif of herself as the Brooklyn imp Hannah Horvath of Girls, the show she created, scripted, and starred in. She's waving her fingers like a boogeyman as she confronts a smiling Patrick Wilson, whose pretty face instantly falls. The clip is from One Man's Trash, an exhilarating episode from the show's 2nd season, in which Wilson plays a handsome doctor who spins with Hannah into a brief and frantic affair. It was a canny reintroduction for Dunham, the GIF form itself, a relic of the Girls era, the callback to the passive-aggressive affectation once observed by millennials sharing their latest online piece. So I wrote a thing, her self-aware jump scare, winking to the fact that many of her previous public engagements created firestorms so intense they seemed to singe the fingers of the audience scrolling along. Now she was back to charm us once again, coaxing us under the covers of her inner life. It's stunning to recall how quickly Dunham's name gained headline recognition and became weighted with significance that one person alone could not bear. She became a synodosh for a whole tangle of identities: white, millennial, liberal, feminist, hipster, brilliant, fat, naked, privileged, self-centered, and oblivious, only some of which she could credibly be accused of embodying at any given time. One Man's Trash itself was, like so many things she touched, bizarrely controversial. The new memoir is titled Famesick, after what she believes this did to her. It begins with Dunham's reflection on how it felt first for her own name to slip out of her grasp, and then for it to grow into a kind of golem that stalked her success and occluded her artistic vision. The announcement of Famesick was met with both excitement for Dunham's return and grumbling at the return of a certain type of discourse, one that I contributed to as a blogger for women-focused sites in the early 2010s. My phone shuddered as that long-dormant internet-wide discussion creaked back into motion and delivered a Slack message from an editor asking if I, a 40-year-old woman who long ago left such youthful pursuits behind, was interested in writing about the peculiar media environment that made and then unmade Lena Dunham. I read the book, my heart pulsing with envy at the creative life she claimed, anxiety at how she lost it, and recognition of myself all over. Internet commenters have staked out their positions. Some rustle through their memories to retrieve old lists of Dunham grievances. Others claim they loved her all along. When Dunham held up her funhouse mirror to young millennials who were uncomfortable in their skin and confused about their place, many became entranced by her vision, jealous of her success, pained by her missteps, and obsessed with how real every facet of the show was. Now they are old enough to appreciate what Dunham did. As one podcaster put it on X, she's like the collective millennial id, and for a moment in the early 2010s, we were her pitless superego. The world that made her. Dunham arrived in threadbare flats at the last gasps of the monoculture and the first breaths of the social internet. New media startups like BuzzFeed, Vox, and Vice News were collapsing news into entertainment and creating jobs for young writers for as long as the Facebook algorithm would support them, and scrambling the lines between celebrity, critic, and fan. BuzzFeed produced many journalists, but also Allison Roman and Quinta Brunson, and everyone with a Twitter account was made to feel as if it were possible to post one's way into their club. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the April 19th issue of the New York Times Magazine on the Niagara Frontier radio reading service. It was the height of what was called lady blogging, a word that now carries the funk of millennial jargon, but at the time represented a fresh outlet for young women who had something to say, whether political snark or self-conscious sex diaries. Girls was met by a generation doing almost real-time memoir and criticism, which became a vehicle for certain internet writers to develop their own persona, voicey and agenda setting, despite their youth and inexperience. The publications attracted their own self-branded fans. Jezebel had its Jezzies, the hairpin its pinners, the toast its toasties. The girls' discourse was so generative because Girls was such a juicy text, enriched by Dunham's public character. She was just as interesting to feminist writers as she was to gossip bloggers and misogynist trolls, who were coming into their power through the coordinated harassment campaign of Gamergate, and would soon move on to the conspiratorial world-building of Pizzagate. There was some confusion in that moment about how to read work of the kind that Dunham was making, but it was read insistently, immediately, often intelligently, but increasingly unsympathetically. This was a fecund period of first-person writing by women that had a transgressive and self-revealing quality, which also had the consequence of creating a kind of adrenalized form of commentary. Blogging was personal, but also a job, often a grind. It created cycles of argument that were rapid, intense, and often punishing for the people at the center, both the subjects and the writers. As post quotas were filled, a slippage occurred between the artist and her public, the blogger and her commenters, the internet famous and the real stars. Girls permeated this media ecosystem from episode 1, which turbocharged its success and rattled the woman at its center. I hadn't expected the swift and vicious hammer of the people who were ostensibly my peers, Dunham writes in the book. New York media in the early 2010s was a very specific kind of Shark Tank, where a story with a hurtful headline was usually written by someone I had once casually known, laughed with at a party, slept with the same cringy guy as. Her critics were more likely to resemble Hannah, her normie alter ego with Midwestern parents, than Dunham, who was raised by avant-garde artists in a doorless Tribeca loft and landed a TV show at 24. But like the cliched hero and villain, who are not so different, you and I, Dunham and her critics became enmeshed in a codependent saga. Neither could let go. An inveterate poster, Dunham lived online and seemed determined to step on the rake of commentary as her influence scaled. Dunham and her then creative partner, Jenny Connor, launched their own media project, Lenny Letter, a year before the 2016 election. Dunham interviewed Hillary Clinton in the first dispatch. Later that year, Dunham said on her Women of the Hour podcast that she wished she could have had the experience of aborting a pregnancy, for which she was widely criticized. She explained that her comment was made under the guise of a delusional girl persona I sometimes inhabit, but this was the kind of artistic frame that worked so winningly in her show and less so in the stricter world to which many of her journalistic critics were tethered. Her name and her auto-fictional project had wandered beyond their creative boundaries, and the internecine debates of blogs had ballooned into a national concern. When Clinton lost the election, some blamed Dunham. Within 5 years, Dunham's propulsive rise had set her up for a long fall. In 2017, on the day she returned home after a hysterectomy, and while she was, as she has clarified, on drugs, she posted a public defense of a male girls writer who had been accused of rape. The fallout finally prompted a retreat from public life. Dunham says she bitterly regrets the statement, but this was in the explosive days of the Me Too era, and the preconditions of the internet at that time inscribed a public figure's banishment with a kind of finality. That was before Donald Trump's re-election, the rise of the anti-woke manosphere, and the cultural backlash to cancellation that released some of the all-consuming expectations placed on artists like her. What is that world now? Lena Dunham was a hinge figure between old forms of criticism and new, often chaotic ones, between crafting a persona as an artist with some degree of cover and doing so in public with every step exposed and instantly processed, between a more freewheeling misogyny and the correctives of a Me Too millennials are still living in the aftermath of her world. Fame Sick is about how her body and mind were damaged by her turn in that gyre. Now she is undertaking a big return to the kind of meta commentary about herself that so defined and dogged her work. Though she has been working steadily all along, none of her projects after Girls generated much in the way of discourse, maybe because many of the outlets that once covered Dunham are now dead. This has cleared the way for a generation-wide Girls rewatch, an opportunity for millennials to experience the show from the vantage of middle age and without the incessant real-time commentary. Younger audiences are also discovering Girls for the first time, some romanticizing the indie sleaze, BuzzFeed listicle, cringe alt covers of rap songs era it represents. In 2026, Girls supplies a pleasing and even quaint respite from contemporary life. But Dunham is in many ways a cautionary tale, certainly for female celebrities, the most successful of whom now run their lives as steel trap operations. Fandoms these days are ridden with sleuths and narcs who jostle for narrative dominance over their favorite artists. Dunham's mumble-score peer Greta Gerwig seems to emerge only to grant formal interviews about her IP-driven blockbuster films, and Dunham's friend Taylor Swift, who has talked about the punishing qualities of the 2010s, has made her persona a monument to control. And for the average person logging onto social media, Dunham prefigured the dangers of a kind of oversharing that continually tosses private citizens into the jaws of fame. The far-right harassment machine has won the day, and it's Dunham's most brutal misogynistic critics who prove to have the most durable legacy, showing people that in a post-woke, casually callous and conspiracy-minded era, sharing one's life can be dangerously consequential. The internet of Dunham's time created a mode of radical self-exposure and then punished people for it. It's rare now and necessary to have a public figure who, despite the costs, opens all of herself to us, this time to promote a book about how that almost killed her. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the April 19th issue of the New York Times Magazine. Your reader has been Evelyn. Thank you for listening.
Coming up next in the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, we have the USA Today. At 2 o'clock, with episode number 6 of We Did Okay, Kid by Sir Anthony Hopkins. Stay with us for these readings and more. You're listening to the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. We broadcast daily readings of printed matter to those who are blind or have a print disability throughout Buffalo, Western New York, and Southern Ontario's Niagara Peninsula. Almost 40 years and more than 300,000 hours of radio readings to those without sight. Our broadcast signal is provided at no charge by WNED. Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service broadcast studios are at 1199 Harlem Road in Cheektowaga. Please let others know about your Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. For more information, call us at 716-821-5555.